Welcome everyone. Let me share my screen. My name is Edward Choi. I am currently in Hong Kong. I base between Hong Kong and London. I'm the co-founder of AI Safety Asia. And welcome very much to join our panel. And today we have quite a special panel to discuss this very important topic, Asia perspective on AI safety, X-risk or spectrum of risk. I'm your host. I'm going to give you a quick intro about myself and also AI Safety Asia. I've spent the past decade operating technology startup in between Hong Kong and London, as well as running a charity supporting education in Myanmar for the past decade. And earlier this year, my co-founder Lian and I, we have decided to start this nonprofit organization called AI Safety Asia, dedicated to reduce catastrophic AI risks by enhancing AI safety and governance in Asia. And we at AISA aims to bridge the gap between global north and global south by fostering local talents in Asia, starting with Southeast Asia, conducting policy research, and also promoting intergenerational dialogue on AI safety, such as the one that we're having right now. And the Jakarta Roundtable is part of the broader series of regional roundtable discussion convened by AISA. We bring together leading experts, policymakers, stakeholders in the field of AI to discuss the unique challenges and opportunities of AI safety in the Asian context. So Jakarta Roundtable is our very first one, and we will have our Manila Roundtable in late October and the Singapore one in November. And now let me tell you a little bit about our expert panels. So the first one that we have is Pak Gita. Pak Gita is the chairman and founder of the investment management company Ancora and also the Ancora Foundation. He's a visiting scholar at Stanford, focusing on the directionality of nation building in Southeast Asia. Pak Gita served as the Minister of Trade in Indonesia and also was the chairman of the government's investment coordinating board. He is the host of the very popular podcast Endgame on YouTube. If you haven't, make sure to check it out. He was also the chairman of the session at the World Trade Organization ministerial conference in 2013. And next we have Prof. Hammam. Prof. Hammam is the president of KORIKA, the chairman of the Institute of Indonesia Technology Auditor, and also the vice president of ASEAN CIO Association, part of the delegate to the AI UK Summit on behalf of the Indonesian government, and also advisor to AI Safety Asia. He has held many important government positions in Indonesia and also has advised many important nation projects across different ministries in Indonesia. And next we have Dr. Robert Trager. Robert is the co-director of Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative, and also he is the international governance lead at GovAI, senior research fellow at Blavatnik School of Government at University of Oxford. He is a recognized expert in the international governance of emerging technologies, diplomatic practice, institutional design, and also technology regulation. He advised a lot of governments and industry leaders on these topics. And last but not least, we have Aspen. Aspen is the director and founder of a very important technical AI safety institute, APART, with more than 80 researchers and with collaboration across OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google DeepMind. He is an advisor to AI Safety Asia, and he sits on the board of Effective Altruism Denmark, and also he's the founder of European Network for AI Safety. And the panel will be moderated by our co-founder, Lian. Lian is the co-founder of AI Safety Asia, and she led the program design and stakeholders engagement. She's listed as one of the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics for 2024. She's currently a senior fellow at CAIDP in Washington, D.C. She has also founded Ambit, an AI governance initiative representing the global majority. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Prof. Hammam to give us a key speech to set the stage. Thank you, Prof. Hammam.
All right. Thank you, Edward. Greetings. Very good afternoon, evening to everyone, to Gita, to Lian, to Esben, and to Robert. Very nice to meet you all. And certainly all of our guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. This is the inaugural roundtable discussion held by the AI Safety Asia. And certainly we will discuss about AI safety. It is a global issue, and it is a critical issue for both Asia as well as Indonesia, especially. So, as we stand on the cusp of an AI-driven future, yeah, it is essential that we approach this journey with really caution, responsibility, and really a commitment to ethical practice. So let's just go ahead and jump into my presentation here. Next. So the importance of AI safety can really is just more than a technical issue. For us, it is a social imperative. In Indonesia, for example, our diverse population and unique cultural landscape, we have 700 plus languages, so many ethical groups within Indonesia. It makes ethical AI adoption particularly challenging. So we must ensure that our AI policies are not only robust, but also reflective of our nation's values and diversity, with so much diversity in our population. And certainly also the AI ability to generate large amount of data, it also impacts lives on a larger scale. That means that we have to navigate these ethical challenges carefully to protect our society for potential harms. How do you ensure that this AI adoption benefits for all? KORIKA, as one of the AI associations, the largest association in Indonesia, we try to really walk the talk, democratizing AI for all. So let me tell you some of the things that we have done. Go ahead. Next slide, please. So we have surveyed 300 plus AI stakeholders around Indonesia that generally shows a positive attitude towards AI, but they express concerns, the need to be addressed. Anxieties about a safe and secure AI is a big part. Inclusivity and fairness are paramount. Our AI system must work for everyone, not just the majority. So, but historical data show that some AI products have failed to perform well with minority groups. Given Indonesia diversity, ensuring representation in AI is a priority. Next slide. So, to address this, the government can start by updating their regulatory values and norms. You know, the 8 major concerns that I have identified in our survey, ranging from economic bias to discriminations, highlight the complexities of AI adoptions. So, what can we do as the government and industry? Okay, so the government must really adopt a globally recognized principle, such as the do no harm, okay, principle and human oversight to ensure AI serves the public good. We have a Indonesia circular letter on ethical AI, which try to, reflect all values that are in our Pancasila, our ideology. But is that enough? This is something that we have to ponder whether this is enough to make AI safe and secure for all of us. Next slide. So a few takeaways that I want to put in my talk this afternoon is that the government must take the lead in updating regulation to reflect global benchmark. There are many risks from misgovernance of underlying infrastructure, data breaches, cyber threats, risk from its misuse, whether it is disinformation, discrimination, criminal activities, risk from weaponization, militarization, and direct harm. Okay, and on the other side, also, the industry has also a critical role to play in upholding the standard of transparency, accountability, and inclusivity. Only through a collective effort, I think, that we can build a safe AI ecosystem, not only in Indonesia, but certainly in the global whole world. So I will stop here. Next slide, please. As we continue on Indonesia AI journey, it is essential to confront the challenge ahead with determination. We need to address a lot of these challenges and embracing the opportunities that AI present. I really welcome the inaugural roundtable discussion initiated by AI Safety Asia. Thank you, Lian, for this. Let's work together to ensure that AI adoption in our region, in Asia, in Indonesia, is ethical, responsible, and safe and contribute to a brighter future for our nation. I want to leave you with a thought. The real problem is not whether machine think, but whether we do think correctly. It is our responsibility to ensure AI is a tool for good, guided by ethical principle and a commitment to safety. With that, I will end my talk. Thank you so much for your participation, and it is my real honor to have provided you with these keynote speeches. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Hammam. I'm gonna share my screen and let's dive into the discussion. With that, I'm gonna pass that to my co-founder, Lian, who will be moderating the panel. Here you go, Lian.
So welcome to the 2024 Roundtable series of AI Safety Asia. Our chosen theme for this year is Asia Perspective on AI Safety, X Risks or Spectrum of Risks. So as my co-founder and host for today's event, Ed mentioned a while ago, this is a part of a series and this theme would be the theme all throughout the year as we do our stopovers for our selected cities in Southeast Asia every month. With that, we are not going to discuss definition of terms, but to briefly point out for the sake of this discussion, when we mention the word X risk, we see it as how the AI safety community refer to it. And it is existential risks posed by advanced AI systems that could lead to human extinction or irreversible global catastrophe. So the Center for AI Safety defined this into 4 buckets, namely malicious use, AI race, organizational risks, and rogue AIs. For further details, you can read the full paper for that categorization. And then in terms of spectrum of societal risks posed by AI, this is a loose categorization of every possible risks among AI safety academic communities, in particular by AI safety fundamentals hosted by Blue Dot Impact as of February 2024. So it includes individual malfunctions, invasion of privacy, copyright infringement, worker exploitation, alongside catastrophic risks, for instance, gradual loss of control, sudden loss of control, active takeover, unknown risks, and other issues that experts in AI policy, regulation, and ethics would even consider concentration of power and the reimagining of institutions as AI to maybe AGI is fully embedded in our societies, the humanity at large, or even in our individual everyday lives. So diving straight to the panel, I will drop my first question to Esben. So Esben, do you believe that existential risks or X risks associated with AI are sufficiently recognized within the governance frameworks of field-leading initiatives of Southeast Asian countries and in Indonesia in particular? Why or why not?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jan. And first off, of course, thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel with all of my amazing co-panelists here. So my answer to that, first off, I will of course caveat I am leading a technical laboratory in globally, and so governance initiatives in many ways are beyond the scope of some of our technical work, though a lot of it does inform the existential risk potential of artificial intelligence. So in this context, I think largely I see existential risk as underexplored by governments across the world, where I think often outside of places like California, and some of the more technologically, like the ones housing the AGI developers themselves, outside of these states and nations, I generally seem to see, for example, in Europe, that there is an underutilization of the sorts of potential AI can bring, but also an under-exploration of what the potential risks could lead to. So in this case, I would assume and go with the answer that there is too little focus within the Southeast Asian regions, and at the same time, I think there is some amazing potential within the region too, with a lot of our researchers, for example, being affiliated with Southeast Asian countries or directly working with some of that through our research work too. So huge potential and a potential for taking the lead as well.
Thank you for that sent, Esben. So now for the second question, and this question is intended for Robert. Given the rapid AI development in countries like China and India, what lessons do you think can other Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia learn about balancing innovation with AI and safety?
Yeah, well, I'm also so glad to be with you all. That's an interesting question. I think we often look at those two as if they're in fundamental tension, one with the other, whereby, if we have safety, then we can't innovate. And I think that framing isn't generally true. It's not true in other industries, and there's no real need for it to be true in this industry. Of course, we have to be careful about regulating in ways that will dampen innovation in ways that we certainly don't want to do. But I think, many of the sorts of regulations that have been proposed are just kind of a tiny fraction of the expense that that companies, we're talking about very large companies who are spending, north of $100 million, and potentially in the future, much more than that to train systems. So the regulatory burden is really a tiny, tiny fraction of that overall expense, at least in terms of the regulations that have been proposed so far. And I think when we think about the sort of globe as a whole, I think, often in other industries where there's sort of dual use aspects or there are safety concerns, we really need to have a regulatory infrastructure precisely so that we can have broad access to the technology. Because if we don't have broad-based safety assurance, then the countries that are at the frontier of the technology use words like non-proliferation, and they attempt to prevent broad-based access, which is exactly what we don't want. So really, I think we need sensible global governance in a way that doesn't imply a trade-off between governance and innovation, which I think in many ways we are moving in that sort of direction. I think politicians are terrified of being labeled anti-innovation, so they're very protective of that space, and so I think with a little luck, we shouldn't have to go for one or the other. Hopefully, we can have both.
Thank you, Robert. That's very insightful. I mean, the idea that regulation is one aspect, though a core aspect of AI governance. I think that holds true. I remember I was having this question with my colleagues in DC, and I asked how we as an organization define AI governance. And one response that I really find interesting was AI governance defined in two aspects. One is the legal mechanism, so the regulation, right, and the policies. And then the other aspect is the safety engineering part, the tools, the readiness of the industries and the stakeholders. So that's very insightful. And I think in terms of comparisons with how, let's say, China and India is doing it, I think there's a stark contrast in terms of how, let's say, the transatlantic countries are doing it. Now to our next question, and this question is intended for Gita. So on the spectrum of AI risks, what do you think are the top 3 AI issues specific to Indonesia that have no point of return if Indonesia does not meaningfully act on it by 2025 to 2026, and why?
Well, first of all, let me just take this opportunity to thank everyone for inviting me to be here. I'll share a number of observations. The first one is with respect to the economics of AI. If we were to take a look at the amount invested in AI by the VCs in the US versus Asia, which is mostly China and Europe, I think the US VC would have invested about $38 billion in the year 2021 or 2022 versus China having invested about $26 to $28 billion and Europe only investing about $8 billion. That, I think, is a manifestation of how perhaps both the US and China have not missed the digital revolution. The second, I think, if we were to listen to quite a number of pundits on the potential value creation that could come from AI, it sort of ranges from 30 to $50 trillion in the next 20 years. Unfortunately or fortunately, most of that is going to accrue to just China and the US at the rate that, you know, they're solely in a position, if not instrumentally in a position to, you know, put where the money, you know, is needed. Because, you know, having spent the last couple of years in Silicon Valley, it's so obvious that AI is much more of an engineering challenge as opposed to a software challenge. Because people always, oftentimes, if not always, talk about scalability. And scalability, I think, is manifested in how the OpenAI mafia is splintering into, you know, the various companies, inclusive of Salesforce, Meta, Amazon, Google, and of course, Microsoft, mimicking whatever we might have seen with respect to the PayPal mafia about 20-something years ago. And that splintering, I think, has taken place only with respect to any company or institution that has the economic wherewithal. And this is a stark contrast to, I think, most Southeast Asian institutions, which do not have the kind of economic wherewithal the way we're seeing it in both China and the US. And the last bit, with respect to the economics, is that if we take a look at Southeast Asia, which is really not blessed with the kind of monetary space and fiscal space that China and the US are, with the absolute exception of Singapore. Singapore runs on a money supply to GDP ratio of more than 200%, but most Southeast Asian economies, particularly Indonesia, runs on a money supply to GDP ratio of less than 50%. And right there, you know that, you know, it's going to be very tough for Indonesia to unleash any kind of value involving AI at the rate that we have very scarce money supply, on top of the fact that our fiscal space is also not very robust. And this is manifested empirically in the low tax ratio of less than 10%. And most Southeast Asian countries actually have tax ratios ranging from 9.5% to only 16%, as compared to OECD countries, which have tax ratios hovering around 33%. So I think we can somewhat conclude that most Southeast Asian countries do not have the monetary space, do not have the economic space necessary to usher the kind of AI narrative that we're seeing or witnessing in China and the US. The last bit is really energy. And people forget that most Southeast Asian countries are not blessed with abundant energy. And this is manifested in the low electrification on a per capita basis. The electrification of Indonesia is only at about 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita, whereas Singapore and Brunei are at about 10,000. And I think for any nation to be a modern nation, it needs to be electrified at least at 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. And when one calculates how many years it will take Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and all the rest to ramp up their pre-existing electrification on a per capita basis from less than 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita to 6,000, it will require about 121 years for Indonesia at the rate that Indonesia can only build 3,000 megawatts per year. And all the other countries are building less than 3,000 megawatts per year. So I think there needs to be some realism when one talks about AI, depending on how or the extent to which they have economic wherewithal, manifested in the fiscal space and monetary space, but also manifested in how they can actually energize the AI capabilities. And when you listen to the Jensen Huangs of the world, you know, the H100 GPU, I mean, he's talking about 10xing the pre-existing capacity of the pre-existing GPU. When one talks about 10xing all the way to 30xing the pre-existing capability, one is essentially talking about energy requirement that amounts to about 10x to 30x. That is just not something that Southeast Asia is blessed with, you know, as to achieve that sort of energy requirement that is so much more massive than whatever pre-existing order we have. The last bit I want to say is, with respect to sustainability, if we were to energize ourselves for purposes of modernizing, including AIing ourselves in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, of course, which represents about 44% of the population and 44% of the collective GDP, Southeast Asia would have to build about a terawatt worth of power generation capability, which will require about $2 to $3 trillion worth of capital formation. At the rate we're attracting in terms of FDI, which is only about $200 billion a year, most of that is not being used for sustainable power generation capabilities. There is no realism with respect to achieving carbon neutrality in the year 2050 and achieving the kinds of AI capabilities that China and the US are striving for. So net, Indonesia has got a lot of homework, but also Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thanks for those sense, Gita.
Could I add something? Is that, or you don't, or that would get us off track, maybe?
Yeah, maybe I can connect it to my next question to you, Robert.
Sure.
Yeah.
Whatever you like.
Yeah. So with that, there's really a lot of work needed in terms of countries that are not known as producers of the technology, part of which is majority of the countries in Southeast Asia. On the other side, while that can be not an area that is the strength of Southeast Asia, we can see some positive notes in terms of the governance side. So the next question will be intended for Professor Hammam. So in the AI and Democratic Values Index AIDV report by Center for AI and Digital Policy in Washington, D.C., Indonesia was ranked top 2 in 2020 and 2021, then rank 1 by 2022 and 2023 among Southeast Asian nations as the most democratically aligned country in terms of AI national policies and initiatives. So my question is, what will make Indonesia stay number one for Southeast Asia? Please give us two things people here should look forward to from Indonesia in the AI governance and safety space.
Wow. Is it really number one? Oh,
Yes.
I'm quite
I should.
surprised. Yeah, thank you, Lian. Well, to stay number one, there are so many things that we need to do, mostly on the divide that has been happening, most of the time since 2020 when we launched the National AI Strategy, exactly on our National Technology Day. Yeah, it has been really a tough time. Just like Pak Gita was putting, we really striving to make the AI as the mainstream in our digital transformation, in our digital economy. Certainly, it is not easy to see that all the required component aspect of AI, not just talking about AI safety in terms of data, governance, infrastructure development, talent development, as well as really bringing use cases which is close to our heart. Yeah, putting the biodiversity and the diversity of populations into places, adopting artificial intelligence is something really a challenge. But it is a forward challenge. So for us, we are going to map this out with the AI readiness assessment that we are currently running, and we will launch this AI readiness and see what happens there. Whether we are keeping our position as number one, there are so many aspects that is lagging from the AI ecosystem in Indonesia, and those are the things that can that have to be collaborated among all the stakeholders, whether it is government, academia, businesses, communities, as well as media. So we'll see it from there. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Prof. Hammam. And as the expert in Southeast Asia, what placed Indonesia first among the Southeast Asian countries is that part of the national AI strategy where ethics and governance was a first pillar. In contrast to other countries. And I believe Indonesia is trying to really make it happen that AI safety in particular and governance would be part of the core priorities for the 2045 National AI Strategy, which I believe would be the third edition of your National AI Strategy. Is that correct,
yes,
Professor Hammam?
Indeed. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we'll continue our journey here. National AI Strategy 2020. You don't include generative AI or anything that have been developing for the past. And in fact, the search and in the adoption of AI is coming from generative AI. So there are a lot of things that we need to embrace, and there's a lot of things also that you will reflect in toward the journey for the future. We are looking at something like Indonesia 2045 as our national long-term planning plan. Yeah, long-term planning, and we see that AI will be the main drivers of getting to Indonesia 25. In fact, okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Hammam. Yeah, so moving forward to our next question, which is intended for Robert. So given the rapid action on AI policies in the EU and UK, what top 2 lessons do you think Southeast Asia as a whole should learn and be considered from 2025 to 2030? And if you can relate it to a point that you want to share a while ago, please do so.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, I think that maybe the first thing to say is that all of the regulatory governance attempts are really in their infancy. So I don't think we're really at the stage where we can say, oh, these are the lessons, this is what went well, this is what didn't go well. In the EU, for instance, we have the AI Act now, which is negotiated over 2 years and has been passed. But nevertheless, it's common for people to say, well, the AI Act hasn't been written yet. And the reason why they say that is because we're currently engaged in concretizing what exactly will be done with the mechanisms of the AI Act. And there's a code of practice process that's happening now, which will determine how the newly set up AI office in the EU actually interacts with and regulates EU AI developers. And that process starts now in September and will continue through April of 2025. So so lessons hard, but nevertheless, maybe a couple of things to say also following on from the two previous speakers. I do think that it's been effectively pointed out that if Southeast Asia were to try to recreate all of the computing infrastructure which exists elsewhere and to scale up that computing infrastructure the way that some of these other places like the US and China are doing, that would be a tall task, shall we say, both from an energy and capital accumulation point of view, and indeed from others, it would be difficult. But I think there's much more to be done, much more to be said. Computing resources elsewhere can be leveraged. I think sometimes countries are a bit too focused in terms of their national strategies on sort of sovereign compute development. And another approach would be to think about the contributions to development that they can make, the contributions to developing common approaches to governance, similar to, for instance, what Singapore has done with its AI Safety Institute, and its Project Moonshot is an example of something that it has developed, governance techniques that it's developed, which it's now open sourcing to the world. And so I think that is an example of the way that other Southeast Asian communities can participate in what really should be a common project for the world in developing these governance techniques.
Thank you, Robert. So now the next question would be for Esben. Given the rapid action on AI safety and policies this time in the US, what is the #1 lesson do you think Southeast Asia and Indonesia should learn and be considered by the region from 2025 to 2030?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Leon. And thank you so much for the insightful comments from all of my co-panelists here. I think I'll take it a bit from the technical perspective again, due to what we work with. And in general, I think to harken back to what Gita was also mentioning, the US is moving really, really fast. They have the researchers, they have drained the brains of the world to Silicon Valley, where a part is also situated in the US for these reasons. And in many ways, they are taking charge in terms of understanding what AI will really bring and where it will go. And what I see from our colleagues there, that is quite different from research collaborators in other locations, and traditionally EU has been quite skeptical as well. They're definitely changing right now and in the last 1.5 years or so. But we see that they really take intelligence of AI seriously. And I think this is the one lesson that I would come with this from our technical background and our work in the US, to push forward. You see a lot of both speculation about where AI will go, and I think some of that is a little bit on the edge of what I would find academically reasonable. But others of it is just very, very reasonable. And you even had a large survey of about 2,700 researchers who have published at the top conferences, where we're also present, and so we know the people there. But these 2,700 researchers, they report that there is quite a very surprisingly high chance for AI to displace human labor and to potentially cause the societal scale or catastrophic and existential risk to humanity. So in that sense, the number one lesson is really to take the intelligence of AI seriously, and begin to think about what will our society look like? What will Indonesia look like? What will Southeast Asian nations' labor force look like once we expect that, I think it's 2040 or 2045 or something like this, that researchers now expect is the time that human level intelligence will be implemented, which just means a level of intelligence that can displace most of intellectual labor, including remote work tasks. So in that sense, you have programming, accounting, legal counsel. You have all these things you can do in a chat or on a computer. And what will happen to the labor force of the Southeast Asian countries at that point? How will we make sure as a region, so speaking from the Southeast Asian perspective, how will you make sure that you understand what the technology will bring and implement these pragmatic tools and solutions to solve this and to solve the problems that will emerge. So yeah, that's the one lesson and a bit of context there.
Thank you so much, Esben. Yeah, so I think the insight that we're getting is if we don't take the intelligence of AI seriously, our current systems of governance will not be able to persist. So our social welfare institution will not hold up. And so my next question would be for Gita. And my question is about governance. So you were once a trade minister yourself in Indonesia. In your view, what top 1 to 2 strategies can be employed to upskill policymakers and civil servants in Southeast Asia and in Indonesia to better understand and implement AI safety measures and to be, as I would say, effective governors of AI, considering that there are positions of power considered for this decade? Over to you, Gita. I believe you
might
are
be
mute, so let me unmute.
As you know, something that's more fundamental that needs to be considered is that the AI narrative is not being pushed forth in an adequately multidisciplinary manner. Generally speaking, and I see a lot of this in the US, and I'm impressed with how these technologists were so brilliant, smart, but there's a bit of hubris to the extent that they're not involving the culturalist, the sociologist, the environmentalist, the moralist, the spiritualist, the philosophers, the economist, to the extent that it's not being pushed forth in an adequately multidisciplinary manner, as a result of which the hallucination is not being hypnotized in an adequately multidisciplinary manner. It will end up what it's likely to end up in a less judicious manner, right? And this is the kind of narrative that's being pushed forth in many developed economies. And unfortunately, we in many parts of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines and Indonesia, we're not blessed with the kinds of blessings that Singapore is blessed with, right? We're not as educated as the Singaporeans are. Singapore has just scored number 1 on PISA. They've toppled China. And Indonesia is number 69 out of 81 countries measured when it comes to PISA. Singapore's got 2 universities that are ranked in the top 20. At Stanford, there is hundreds of Singaporeans, only 27 Indonesians. So when you talk about governance, it's really about connecting power and talent, right? It's the ability of selecting talent a lot more based on meritocracy as opposed to patronage and or loyalty. Unfortunately, many democracies around the world, including that in Indonesia, have been selecting talent a lot more based on patronage and or loyalty. So whatever you get in terms of trying to frame a framework for anything, including AI, will be a manifestation of the quality of that intersection between power and talent, which is greatly suboptimal at the moment. And it's not uniquely in Indonesia, but it's in many other democracies, in many other developing economies. Without mentioning countries, I think there is a high degree of tendency for countries like Indonesia and others that do not comprehend the consequences of AI the way the Singaporeans do. They tend to be opening the kimono a little too fast, too early, without understanding whether or not this narrative is going to end up in a judicious manner. So we are basically shackled, right, in a place where we're forced to adapt to whatever the United States and China and the other developed economies are trying to concoct, without actually having the necessary soft infrastructure to think properly. On top of the fact that we're sort of stymied economically without the ability to put forth the economic capital necessary for us to AI ourselves a lot better, if not more robustly. I'm not aware of any national strategy that does not account for national interest. And I'm not aware of, the fact that the Amazons of the world think very passionately about Indonesia. I'm not aware of the fact that the Metas and the Salesforce of the world think very passionately about the national interest of Indonesia, that of India, that of the Philippines. I think they think a lot more for their shareholders, which at times do not intersect in a good way with the national interest of many other countries. So I'm just pointing out some of the limitations that perhaps countries like Indonesia might be exposed to. So when we talk about framing a certain narrative from a governance standpoint, I think there's a structural limitation because of that lack of comprehension of the actual narrative and how this could end up with respect to the people of Indonesia, the people of the Philippines, the people of Laos, the people of Myanmar, the people of Cambodia, a lot less so with respect to the people of Singapore. Singapore, I think, has thought it out very carefully about AI, a lot more carefully. I mean, I talk with the Singaporeans quite a lot on this. I think they're a lot more on the ball as opposed to the other Southeast Asians. And I think they're showing a higher degree of measuredness with which they want to push forth with the AI narrative.
Thank you very much, Gita. Indeed, it is a very huge challenge for all nations. That being the case for Southeast Asia, with one nation that is a global North nation. So 10 out of 11 are categorically global South. And so when AISA intended its objective to be a field-leading nonprofit for AI safety and governance, talent development, with a focus in global South nations in Asia, and for its launching year with a focus in Southeast Asia in particular, it is indeed a huge challenge, but we are trying to gear up for that the demand to do as such. And so for my last question, specific questions to the expert guest, I will intend this for Robert, maybe as a note for organizations like AISA. If you have, and if there's none, please let us know why, at what rate or year, or maybe other better metrics, you estimate it is too late or no point in return in terms of wider international governments if you do not work around the power and talent concentration on AI safety and governance between global North and global South nations. So not to fearmonger, please explain to us and to our expert panelists here and to our audience, the urgency and the threshold that influence the demand in adopting so. Over to you, Rob.
Well, that's a great question. I think the specific question of timelines is fraught and is difficult. And the more important thing to say really is that we don't know, but we don't know in a way that means that some very significant transformative developments in AI could arrive very, very quickly. That's a possibility. Also, as Espen was saying, and the leading figures in the field are unsure themselves, and they don't know. And we have examples from history, on both sides of these things, of people in the know predicting that a development would happen much later than it actually happened, or much earlier than it actually happened. An example is the Wright brothers, who famously said that people flying would, I think they said, take at least 60 more years, and that was just a few months before they themselves were flying. So these things are hard to predict, and because they're hard to predict, we really need to prepare for it to come at any time. Computer scientists talk about anytime code. Well, in other words, code that will be able to deal with whatever happens whenever it happens, speaking loosely, and that's what we need. We need now to take actions that will allow us to be prepared whatever happens. And the whole world has a role, I think, to play here. I think maybe another thing to say is that places like Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries, they are users of these technologies. They are also developers of these technologies. They're exciting startups that exist in this space. Many of them, as has been pointed out, are partnering with technologists and technologies elsewhere. But those actors, they need a certain amount of governance now for the things that they're doing now, and to making sure that what's happening is in compliance with the range of ethical principles that we've discussed. But we also need to be thinking about the next turns of the crank, when those developers today are fine-tuning models that are created elsewhere, or doing even more exciting things tomorrow. What are the sorts of regulation we need? Things are coming. We're talking about AI agents, for instance, arriving pretty soon, probably. Nobody knows exactly when, but we're going to need governance for those AI agents. That probably means tracking the things that those agents are doing in case they're doing something we don't want them to be doing, and there's a later court case, and we have to show, okay, this agent was doing this thing. So there's just a large range of things that I think are, in fact, relevant to everyone in the world, that everybody can participate in thinking about. So I just think that we need to be building these ties and building up capacity around the world to address all these questions. And maybe just lastly, one quick thing to say is that partly in response to things that others were saying, there are areas like, let's say, aviation safety. We have an international regime for aviation safety that has been extraordinary at raising aviation safety around the world. So in spite of all the different variation in governments and capacity in governments, we have this international set of standards and international set of incentives that mean that countries around the world, including in Southeast Asia, participate in and effectively assure safety of that technology. So I think we need to move towards similar things in the case of AI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. So that's really insightful. As an expert myself in Southeast Asia, I will drop a year and I will drop a requirement. So in my view, by 2027, and this is a loose estimate, of the year, but I am more or less convinced that by 2027, for any country in particular, if your national government has no AI safety, and AI governance native speaker in your country by 2027, then that's concerning. Because relating it to what Robert is saying, these people are the ones that will start to set the standards, the governance mechanism, the mandates that getting the airline and aviation metaphor, the pilots, the flight stewardess, the security people, that equivalent for AI safety and governance would work on. So that's my view. And with that, we are moving forward to the concluding question of this roundtable. So AISA asks for Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. Ed? If you are to answer in terms of proportion, how Indonesia should allocate its AI safety and governance resources, X risk is to spectrum of societal scale risks, what will be your choice and why? So just the context, at the moment, the research says that the number one issue for Southeast Asia on AI is disinformation and misinformation. And there are a tentacle of risks that are associated with AI. So I would like to ask this question to all the guest speakers, but please let's intend to have it 2 minutes per response so that we can cater for Q&A among our audience. So let's start with Gita. So would it be A, B, or C? Or if you want to challenge the question, then please let us know what's your take.
Well, I mean, if the question is how much we're going to be able to allocate, right? We go back to our fiscal space. And I've told you, our fiscal space is structurally challenged. Our tax ratio, which is the ratio of our tax revenues to the GDP, has plummeted from 15% to 9.5%. On the back of trying to build a new capital city, on the back of trying to provide free lunches, both of which will require about 1,000 trillions rupiah, right? That's about 80 billion US or 70 billion US. So we might end up having just a few crumbs for AI governance strategy or implementation strategy before we even begin to think about how we're going to be able to attract capital formation for actually becoming an AI creator. At best, we can become an AI consumer. And I've laid it out earlier that, you know, these companies are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on AI capabilities in the US and China, much less so in Europe, even much more less so in Southeast Asia. And if the reference to 2027 is as the absolute deadline for all Asian countries to have concocted an AI strategy, we can have a strategy even before 2027. But I think the more fundamental question would be, or could be, whether that strategy is the right strategy, right? And I do believe that we've got to think this through a lot more carefully. And I think we need to figure out a way so that there is a better intersection between power and talent, so that that framing will become much more judicious for the 280 million people in Indonesia. So in short, not much will be able to be allocated. Hammam is working day and night on this, right, to try to figure out how to frame this thing forward. But at the end of the day, if he's not budgeted with the right kinds of amounts that will be required for him to frame it judiciously for the 280 million people, it will be an exercise of futility.
Thank you very much, Gita. So I guess the question was approached in terms of the realities of the case for Southeast
I don't
Asia
mean to
and
sound
Indonesia.
critical, Leanne, but
Yeah.
I'm a realist. I try to approach this with realism. And I do see the way these behemoths in Silicon Valley, I think, just plowing money for lots of things that really do not align with the interest of many people on the planet. And I think there is a risk of further elitization of the pre-existing economic order. And we've seen this happening in the last couple of decades. Increase in economic inequalities manifested in income, wealth, and opportunities, and also increasing centripetality of economic development, where the GDP per capita growth in primary cities has been much more accelerated than that in secondary, much less smaller regional cities. So that I think is at risk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, so let me put the question into a context as our other guest speakers answer. So let's say that you have the influence to advise the presidential administration per country, because that's one way as well to maybe stand up representing the people of that country in terms of how, let's say, the big tech companies, as Gita mentioned a while ago, influencing the global market. It is the national administration per country that can stand up representing the country, right? So to answer in terms of proportion, if our next guest speakers can advise the president of Indonesia in terms of allocating resources for AI safety and governance, which should be a national priority, in my view, how would you try to approach the question? To Robert and then Esben.
Yeah. Well, that's an important, interesting question. So I guess I would say that, well, I think I wouldn't start by dividing between sort of catastrophic risks, which is a term I like a little better than X risk myself, and societal scale risks. I think I think that many of the things that we would do for the one are relevant for the other, and I think just having sort of sensible governance overall is a way to think about it. I think that there are international resources and efforts that can help countries who are working on having good governance in this area. UNESCO has its RAMS program, which I think has advised 58 countries now in terms of their national AI strategies and compliance with a set of ethical principles. So that's very sensible, I think, to collaborate with them. I think also ITU and others at the UN have programs that are relevant. We have a project now thinking about countries that are thinking about AI safety institutes and how they would constitute them for local contexts that is funded by and in consultation with the ITU. And so I think those are the kinds of international resources that countries can make use of. Also, regional organizations are sensible. It would be, I think, quite sensible for many Southeast Asian nations to work very closely together with Singapore, for instance. And that's not to say that's the only way to do it, but that would be one sensible way of doing things. Singapore has set up a safety institute. They have a regulator that's separate from the safety institute. They have other organs within the government that are focusing on AI safety. So I think sort of making common cause, adopting common standards, all these things are useful. And yes, there are real challenges here, as has been pointed out. But if countries aren't doing these things, then I think a few years down the road, they will find it harder to participate in international markets because because there are, for instance, AI developers in Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries, and they would like to participate in global markets. That's very important to them. But I think over time, there's a good chance that some of those markets will be closed to them unless they have good governance locally that ensures safety provision. So there's both the question of the users in those countries and assuring that they have the appropriate governance and also access, but also the question of developers in all these countries and ensuring that they have access to markets broadly. So I think, just like in the aviation example that we were using, in spite of all the challenges, there are steps that simply need to be taken because of these international imperatives.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I request to Esben to package it into 1 minute as much as possible. So in contrast to the aviation metaphor that Robert is using, maybe relate it to, let's say, how countries and presidential administrations can learn from the tragedy of COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the whole risk management and mitigation aspects as we approach this question of spectrum of risks with AI. So to Esben.
Nice. Well, wonderful question. I was actually working a bit on like the modeling of society in Denmark as well during COVID in terms of the societal response. And I think largely also talking with Californian modelers of COVID, I see that there is a general lack of understanding of the potential for the risks to happen, and will echo many of Robert's points there in terms of building local capacity, building national capacity, talent capacity, where we work with a lot of people and try to enable talent across the world, including underserved individuals from apartheid. And some of our events have been hosted as well in Southeast Asia, and a lot of collaboration in Singapore. Apropos, I think it was 300 times more safety papers than the rest of Southeast Asia last I checked, which is quite a difference. So catching up there and building out national talent infrastructure, and specifically, I think my concrete suggestion would be an AI safety institute, just like a pandemic safety institute would be a very, very valid thing to begin to build as well.
Thank you very much, Esben. And of course, I cannot have the man who is working day and night on this cause for Indonesia. And of course, my very close partner in working out this initiative for the Southeast Asia at large. To Professor Hammam, let's take this as if the ASEAN and your president is hearing us right now, how would you approach this question?
Yeah, this is our new president will be taking office in October, right? So this is just the right moment for you to ask this question. And I will, reconsider the Indonesian National AI Strategy 2045. I think you know very well, Lian, that it emphasizes on the development of AI for national progress and competitiveness, right? So I would recommend allocating our AI safety and governance resources just 10% to the existential risk and more to 90% to societal scale risk proportion. Because we really want to have our people to benefit, for the society to benefit in terms of the economic benefits. I walk alone. I walk along with what Pak Gita have mentioned. It is necessary for us to maintain the awareness for the potential long-term risks, and that goes into the society, the societal scale risk. Yeah, we want the economic development, the human resource development, health and social welfare. I think those are a few areas mentioned in our national AI strategy, and that's why I put emphasize on those societal risks rather than for the existential here. Of course, we want to foster this AI literacy and skill development. And I mean, this roundtable is great. It is a way for us, to reach out to all the people, so we don't have. It's not just about the sophistication of generative AI or many other AI, the AGI and many other things, but how you can combat the AI literacy and make use of this AI across the population. So that's my answer
Thank
to
you very
your
much,
question. Thank you.
Professor Hammam. So I guess no expert guest answered a particular letter, which is okay. In my case, for me, at the moment, it can change, of course, depending on what year we're talking about. But for me, I'm on the case of each country cannot go below 10%, because when a catastrophic risk is about to come, it is very important that there has to be at least 2 experts who knows the intricacies of the country to talk with should there be any emergency call at the global level or the transnational level. And with that, we are moving forward to the audience. And before we proceed to the Q&A, we asked during the registration, what's the take of our audience into the same question that we asked our expert guests. And 46.4% out of the 153 responses says that it's 30% X risks and 70% societal scale risk. Should there be an alignment and the resources available or already allocated just for the AI safety and governance chunk? At least as how this question was defined, we are just looking at the AI governance and safety separate from the AI R&D. So with that, we will open the question to Q&A. I believe we still have time, at least for one question. Let's give it up to our audience.
Sure. One question from the audience is, how can we ensure AI safety and alignment efforts are more inclusive of the global south, recognizing the disproportional impact on emerging technologies on these regions?
I will consider the question for Professor Hammam and then for Gita as representatives of Indonesia. First to Professor Hammam, let's keep it to a minute, and then to Gita. Professor Hammam, looks like you are on mute.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So this is actually what we are working on. I think we went to put the global south in the perspective, in the spotlight. Okay. Because it's not, if you talk about what is currently happening in the most of part of the world, it is being led by the global north in terms of ethical and responsible AI. So we want to contextualize AI safety for the global south. We need to develop AI safety guidelines that reflect the unique challenge and priorities for our developing nations. And this include addressing the AI impact on the informal economics and traditional industries. As you know, Indonesia, for example, it is 99% is micro and small medium enterprises, right? And 61% of our GDP comes from this micro and small medium enterprise. So you have to let them embrace this AI and make this, AI benefit for their growth and for their innovations. So this is what my position towards your question. All right. Layan?
Thank you very much, Professor Hammam. And just for a context, AI safety, in particular AI governance, can be very political at the international governance or even transnational governance level. And just a context for our audience, usually this conversation go at the G7 or G20 conversations. And for Southeast Asia, Singapore is not part of G7 and G20. Good thing Indonesia is part of G20. So in terms of global South perspectives coming from Asia, in G20, that would be China, India, and for Southeast Asia, part of which would be Indonesia. And to Gita, what's your answer to the question? Perhaps
Yeah,
Ed, you can.
I agree with Hammam's points of contention, particularly with respect to the micro, small, medium entrepreneurship. We're talking about 125 million people in Indonesia that are employed. And I would say with comfort that I think a good chunk of that is exposed, right? Exposed to the risk of being dislocated. At such time, AI, gets a lot more omnipresent. And the only way to medicate that or to counter that is to empower these people with whether it's upskilling or reskilling capabilities, or get them to be more proficient as to better embrace the future. And a lot of them are not equipped, to be fair about this. The second point I would make with respect to the global South, I think Indonesia represents the pulse of the global South, with some exceptions, right? There are some, very developed members of the global South. Indonesia is a typical developing economy with a GDP per capita of $5,000. And I think it is at risk, as I said earlier, of not being a meaningful beneficiary of this economic delta that AI is going to be able to entail. And I would bet that a good chunk of the economic delta that AI is going to entail is going to accrue to China and the US primarily, at the rate they're making the investments for that very purpose. Secondarily, Europe, then perhaps Japan, Korea, India. I think most countries in Southeast Asia are exposed. We're at best going to be a consumer of AI. We're not going to be a good enabler of AI. We're not going to be, a good creator of AI on the back of those limitations that I've laid out. I don't mean to sound like a cynic. I just try to sound like a realist because I deal with both spheres, the elite world and the non-elite world, and they just don't intersect, as much as I would like for them to do.
Thank you very much, Gita. Indeed, indeed. For the past 2 years, I was working day and night for an AI governance perspective that is representative of the global South nations that are not producers of the technology. Hence, the upcoming term global majority was popping up in recent AI governance
Lian, let me
discussions.
just add one small point, okay?
Sure.
If you go to London, Beijing, Tokyo, Canberra, Washington, if anybody want to know about Southeast Asia, the first thing they call is the Singaporean High Commissioner or Ambassador. They don't call the Laotian Ambassador. They don't call the Bruneian Ambassador. They don't call the Thai, Malaysian, Filipino, or Indonesian Ambassador because of this predisposition that the Singaporean is smart and the Singaporean can tell stories the way the Indians do. The best storytellers in Asia are the Indians and the Singaporeans. The other Southeast Asians need to tell the stories so that these stories get incorporated in the way the AI narrative ought to be pushed forth. And I'm just concerned with the lack of storytelling capabilities of other Southeast Asians, for purposes of things that are good for Southeast Asia. And
I'm so sorry, Gita. You are on mute.
Yeah, why don't you just, consult or piggyback on the Singaporeans? Because the Singaporeans have greatly told the story on behalf of Southeast Asia, and there is bias in the way that story is being told to the rest of the world. So how do we push this forth? We got to multidisciplinarize this. We got to rope in the culturalists, philosophers, spiritualists, environmentalists, economists, and we got to make sure that everybody is included in the conversation. At the rate that it's being done right now, which is not inclusive, there's a risk fundamentally with regards to how the AI narrative is being pushed.
Thank you very much for that, Gita. I mean, the last point, I cannot agree more. And if there's any maybe a more positive outlook on this in terms of an AI governance framework representative of global South nations or the global majority that are not producers of the technology, we can look at the other regions. There are researches and a lot of literature in terms of the approaches, how, for instance, the African Union is doing this. They are not producers of the technology. How the Latin America is doing this. Most of their countries are not producers of the technology, but their governance mechanisms are making its way. So we can look at that, and this is a wake-up call for Southeast Asia to have the Southeast Asia narrative that is inclusive and diverse, especially in terms of AI safety and governance. We have last 5 minutes, so perhaps we can get Robert and Esben's take on this, considering and maybe a focus on, in contrast to the perspective locally at the region, maybe an approach in terms of the knowledge domain, the field itself, AI safety for Esben and global AI governance for Robert. Let's have first with Esben, the safety engineering part.
Wonderful. Yeah, maybe I'll start off by echoing a little bit of what Gita mentioned as well, and it's been very interesting to see in the last couple of days the European Commission and Mario Draghi's wonderful report on the competitiveness of the European Union, which also exactly emphasizes the somewhat exactly the same points as Gita, but at, of course, a slightly different level. But Europe compared to the US and China, and the sort of pretty radical measures that the European Commission is now proposing to take in Europe. When it comes to the technical field, I think largely, so I see this. Maybe to also keep it positive, I guess, as you mentioned, in the sense of seeing a potential narrative for Southeast Asia, which is unique, right? And this storytelling, I think, is something that where I'm worried about the subjectification of countries to the algorithms that come out of other countries and of other nation states. And in our case, a lot of this comes from the US in terms of social media has been the story from the 2000s. And we see that the European Union took on a narrative of, okay, let's now sovereignify the data that is being used here, and let us come ahead with innovative policy. And once, sometimes I read some policy paper from 2015 or something, and they talk about consciousness of AI agents, and this is a commission report. And I'm like, wow, okay, they have some sort of understanding, some sort of directionality to their legislation, where the report itself was about like rights of robots, and was, okay, we have to figure this out now because it's coming. And in that sense, I think European Union has taken on that sort of story of proactive legislation, for better for worse. Africa has taken on a very good story, I think, in some cases or in some areas of this diversity of perspectives and the debiasing of algorithms and the adequate respect for the communities there. Which is quite like, and the unique cultures that come from Africa. And in the same way, I think Southeast Asia could find, I'm not sure which is the best for the technical domain, but could probably find a place where there's a different sort of approach to the security and safety research than what you might see in the West. And for Gita's point as well, the multidisciplinarity of research, I think, is something that's severely lacking, and that I think would be, and I've seen at least some technical research take that more seriously within Asian regions and European regions than Chinese or US regions. And then you can argue, oh, is that because the US just accelerates really, really fast, and then you do like monoculture, and well, then you get really fast data development, but it's just one way. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly which specific narrative, but I think developing that narrative seems really, really interesting and high potential for a region on the planet.
Thank you very much, Espen. Totally, and maybe in terms of the safety and technical field, if there's any model that I'm seeing right now, a representative of global south or global majority nations, this year, a bill was considered in Argentina, so not a producer of the technology, but they had a bill about having an observatory, a monitoring legislation and a body of, and a policy to have the funding and the allocation just for monitoring the AI risks. I think that's a very good start for the safety and technical field. In fact, I haven't seen that in global North nations. Argentina quite did that for the AI safety field, so that's good. Now that we are transitioning to Robert in terms of international AI governance, transnational for that matter, considering that it's 11 nation states for the case of ASEAN. Just to give a context, with, let's say, the African Union, there is a Caribbean AI roadmap already by 2020. So we get the sense of urgency, right? If it's not 2020, 2021. And their priority as a region, their number one, which is a different take, a different narrative to AI, is that their first concern is the environmental impacts of AI and how should that coincide with a region like them with unique vulnerabilities, or maybe not unique, but relatively different vulnerabilities and contexts, contrast to other regions. So what would be your approach to the question, Robert, as a concluding point for this roundtable in 2 minutes, please?
Okay, well, just to follow on all of the excellent comments. Yeah, so I think what I would say, maybe I'll just make 2 points. One is that, I think we have to be a little bit careful about defining who we're defining as a producer or not a producer, and what we mean by that, because there are excellent firms in all over the world, including in Southeast Asian countries and or South Asian countries, and also in Africa, excellent, very interesting LLM developers who are there. And so again, I would draw a bit of a distinction between developers who exist all over the world and sort of computing resources that are a bit more concentrated, and particularly the firms are more concentrated in particular places. And so I think the other thing maybe that I just want to say at the end is that, we've asked about, well, how are we going to have greater influence for global South, global majority, and I think upskilling, sort of capacity building is simply essential for that. If you think about standardizing processes and the traditional standard setters, international standard setters, they are places that are open to everybody. Everybody can go in and participate in most cases. Sometimes there's a little fee, but it's, everybody can participate. But as a practical matter, who really has the influence in setting those standards? It's the people with the expertise, which are usually in industry. And so they have outsized influence in those standards conversations. So if Indonesia, if another country wants to have influence in the global conversation, echoing things that Leon was also saying, we need to have people in that place who know the local context, but also understand the technology well enough, understand the international context well enough that they can represent those local interests, which is essential. There are local, there are ways in which the needs of the local context are different from the needs elsewhere. We need to remember that much of the globe is not even on the internet. I think it's still over a quarter of the globe is not on the internet according to the ITU statistics. So those places might need AI for thinking about optimizing crop yields, but they might not be able to connect to some giant model somewhere else. So they need something different. And it has to be people with a knowledge of that local context, but also a knowledge of the technology and broader things that can forward those interests. So I guess I just want to say that we need to upskill. We need to not divide ourselves into sort of the binary of producer and not producer, and we need to have inclusive governance conversations. And in order to do that, we need people all around the world who are knowledgeable about the technology and about the governance of the technology.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was indeed a good note. And so here's to us, AI, everywhere, everything, all at once. And more all to the point, I think it just goes to say that there is really a need for governance and safety in different levels, whether that be local, national, regional, and global, and the need for that to be aligned across. I'm going to be passing it over to the roundtable's host, Ed.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone who spoke at the panel, and thanks, Lian, for moderating. If you are interested for our next upcoming roundtable series for Manila and Singapore, please follow us on LinkedIn, and we'll keep you posted. And thanks, everyone. Have a nice day or nice evening. Goodbye. Take care.